Welcome back to the program. We're discussing the top 1% of the wealthiest people and their influence on politics and policy around the world. Joining us is Darrell West, Vice President of the Washington D.C. think tank, the Brookings Institute. He also has written a book about this topic. Also joining us on set is Yukon Huang, a former World Bank employee for the China division and now with the Carnegie Endowment. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us. Darrell, let me start with you. When we look at the United States political system, would it be fair to say that all those nice things like for the people, by the people, have now been replaced with for the corporations, by the corporations?
Certainly there is extraordinary wealth in the United States, and these people are attempting to convert their economic power into political power. We have the 2014 elections becoming the battle of the billionaires. The Koch brothers are spending $290 million trying to influence the Senate races. Michael Bloomberg is spending about $50 million to try and fight gun violence. Tom Steyer's putting $50 million into elevating public awareness about climate change. So wealth has become a major factor in American politics.
Yukon Huang, we often talk about the widening income gap in the United States, but it is also very prevalent in developing economies, isn't it? If we look at China, I mean, China's got an economy that's growing. It's, some people think, the biggest economy in the world, but not everybody in China has reaped the benefits, have they?
Well, let me differentiate between income and wealth. Incomes have been increasing dramatically, 10 or 15% a year for several decades, but it's primarily spatial differentiation. Urban areas are 3 times as wealthy as rural, and the coastal areas are much more wealthy than the interior. But if you look at assets, the wealth, the accumulation of stocks, property, it's a quite different phenomenon. And it's a phenomenon only of the last several decades. It comes from 2 sources: land, ability to use land, and the privilege to operate certain kinds of businesses, financial services, franchises of various forms, and these have generated incredible wealth. And it also comes from entrepreneurship. You see people developing new industries. These are extremely valuable in China.
So do you have a small number of people actually having most of the wealth?
You do have a heavy concentration of wealth. And you notice it in certain areas. The last 10 or 15 years, those who've been in property development, those who have been in consumer industries and have a very wide spread, those in financial services. For example, if you have a license to sell insurance and it didn't exist, you make a huge amount of money. And this is a relatively small group of people, very much connected to the party, the system, and it creates some tensions.
Right, Darrell, you mentioned earlier on all these high flyers in the United States who spend thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases on political campaigns. How do they use that to influence politics in the United States?
They're doing a variety of different things. In our 2014 elections, they are associated with organizations that are actually running ads, so they're making direct pitches to voters and trying to persuade them to vote either Republican or Democrat. A number of them have developed a variety of nonprofit organizations, and so billionaires and other wealthy individuals are working through these organizations. That often has the advantage of secrecy. Many of these nonprofit organizations do not have to disclose their donors, and so we're seeing that combination of big money and secrecy become a major problem in the United States.
And to a large extent, Darrell, that the kind of practices that you were talking about there have been supported by the judicial branch of government. I mean, they have the U.S. Supreme Court, which is, in fact, taken decisions that entrench that.
The Supreme Court has issued several rulings in recent years that have blown gaping loopholes in our system of campaign finance. After the Watergate scandals of the early 1970s, we tried to clean up American politics. There were spending caps on what candidates could spend during an election campaign. There were public disclosure rules. Wealthy people could contribute, but they had to say how much they were contributing. Now, we have essentially reverted to the pre-Watergate period where there's big money going in. We don't necessarily know the source of it in many cases. There's a lot of secrecy, and all of that is very toxic for any type of democratic political system.
Right, Yukon Huang, when we look at China, you know, we talked about the few having a large portion of the wealth in China. There's a big question mark about how the few obtained that wealth, and President Xi Jinping, one of his signature policies has been to crack down on corruption in China. How successful has he been?
I think this is a huge task, and it's not something that can be solved very quickly. It's very, very complicated. Corruption comes from many forces at work. It comes from what I would call, what people would call illegal activities, bribery, doing things which are inappropriate. But it also comes from the fact that the government controls access to assets, the opportunities to make money. And if that's allocated in an inappropriate way, then it creates corruption. So it's a very deep and extensive problem in the system. And the government's trying to deal with this, but it's not going to be something that's solved very, very quickly.
But the people who are getting rich very quickly are people who are politically well connected.
Some are and some aren't. And I would like to differentiate between what I would call income or wealth disparities of the good kind. The good kind is their opportunities. You're an entrepreneur. You're developing something from nothing. And it's good for everybody. You generate jobs, income, and rapid growth. So that's good difference, good disparity. There are bad disparities. Bad disparities come from corruption. They come from connections, privileges, and these generate a sense among the population of unfairness, not equal opportunity. And that's what I would call bad income disparity.
Right. Darrell, if we look at the, if I could call it political class right now, the way countries are ruled around the world, we see in many instances that people at the heads of government are millionaires in themselves. I mean, we look at Italy, Berlusconi is a multimillionaire. We look at, right now, Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko is a millionaire. And of course, in the United States, we have, I think, almost the entire US Senate are made up of millionaires.
There certainly is a big connection between wealth and politics. In my Billionaires book, I looked around the world. Billionaires have actually run for office in more than a dozen different countries, and most of the time they win. In the United States, we had the example of Michael Bloomberg being elected 3 times as mayor of New York. As you point out, when you look at the U.S. Senate, most of these individuals are millionaires or multimillionaires. So there is a very tight connection between having money and having access to political power.
And Yukon Huang, when we look at China and we look at the wealth gap, as you pointed out, there's a big difference between people who live in the rural areas, people who live on the coastal areas. As we look ahead, what kind of long-term impact is this going to have in China?
Well, if you look at China, let's say 30 years ago, it was 80% rural, 20% urban. It's now 50-50. This migration is changing the economic as well as demographic landscape of China. Urban incomes are more than 3 times rural. That gap is the highest in the world. And why is it so extreme? It's because China has a residency policy which actually makes it difficult for people to go from the rural areas to urban areas. And the more that people actually move, and they're moving to places where there are more jobs, this is going to actually be a big equalizer. So that's very, very good. People are also, of course, moving from the interior provinces to the coastal provinces. They're starting to actually move to the central provinces because lots of activities are occurring there. So I think a great equalizer in China is actually the ability to move to where the best jobs are, and this will help a lot. But you also, of course, have to address it in other ways. You have to talk about access to property, the tax laws. In the United States, you have capital gains taxes, inheritance taxes. It equalizes wealth over generations. Now, in China, the wealth is a first-generation phenomenon. And the question of inheritance taxes, capital gains taxes, property taxes, they don't exist. So a big situation in China is, how do I deal with this so that over the future, this inequality becomes moderated?
Darrell, we see a lot of reports here telling us that when we look at the wealth gap, the income gap in the United States, the middle class, which has been often considered the bedrock of the American success story, is shrinking. What is the long-term impact of that going to be in the country?
If current trends continue, the middle class is going to continue to be squeezed. When you look at income gains over the last 3 decades, most of the gains have accumulated to the top 10%, so people who are below that have suffered. I'm personally sensitive to this because I grew up in a rural area on a dairy farm, but I was fortunate to have great opportunities, got a great education, and went on to do very well. But I worry that the young kid today who lives in those rural areas or grows up in the middle class is not going to have the same opportunities that I personally had.
Yukon Huang, when we look at some of the solutions that are being proposed right now to close this gap that we've been talking about, in China, for instance, there's a crackdown on corruption, but what are the other things, other policies that the government should adopt?
Well, the government has been improving the education system, and in some ways they've gone much faster than perhaps is even desirable. There's 7 times as many people graduating from college, universities today compared to 15 years ago. A byproduct of that is actually the salaries of the graduates have actually declined or narrowed compared to the high school people. So that's actually a tension. Demand for people from high school and then the middle class workers actually increasing. It's one of the few countries in the world where wages of what I would call the average person has soared. But then most people are not getting their income from jobs. They're getting it from activities, commercial entrepreneurship, land, property. That's a different issue. And there, I think you have to basically figure out how to become more equitable in the access to land and the access to assets, open up markets, competition. China is trying to actually clamp down on monopolies and big companies. This is actually creating tensions with the West because it's seen as being anti-foreign companies. But in reality, as the government says, it's basically trying to make it more competitive throughout, both domestic and foreign companies.
And Darrell, when we look at some of the solutions being proposed in developed countries, we have the French economist Thomas Piketty, who is proposing something called a global progressive tax, where, you know, people who are just starting out, of course, they'll be taxed at a lesser rate, a smaller rate, and people who are billionaires are going to pay the biggest amount of tax. Is that something that's going to work?
There are a few countries around the world, such as India, that have a wealth tax, but it's not clear that it's very practical or it's going to achieve the results that reformers want. So what I emphasize in my book are other ways to promote economic opportunity. It's very important to invest in education. It's very important to promote healthcare. Those are the things that today are holding middle-class people back. And so those are the policy areas where I think we need to focus.
Okay. Yukon Huang, in the United States, you know, although it might be generating a lot of wealth, the social safety net, if I could call it that, is limited. You know, people who are unemployed only get benefits for a certain amount of time. Social security is having a problem. What is the situation in China?
I think China has actually been very recognized this as a major problem. The most serious aspect was rural areas, when the health system basically disappeared. The old system where you got it from the firms and you got it from the state farms, that disappeared. Urban citizens basically got health insurance from the companies they work within, and the municipal governments provided. In rural areas, they didn't have any. So there's been a lot of focus on rural health systems. There is also increasing focus on unemployment benefits and contributing to an employment fund. They're building up a Social Security as well as a retirement pension funds. So these are all being built up. This has just started within the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. It's only going to have an impact maybe 5 or 10 years from now. One of the consequences, however, is that the average worker has to pay a lot of taxes. Here in the United States, we pay a lot in Social Security taxes and medical taxes and fees. This didn't exist in China 10 or 15 years ago. It is becoming a significant issue now.
Darrell, I want to look at one other country in Europe when we look at this widening gap, and that is Spain. How did Spain end up becoming the most unequal country in Europe?
When you look at countries that have a lot of inequality, it is generally a combination of their tax and spending policies. That countries that do a better job managing inequality have progressive tax rates. They invest in things like education and healthcare that provide opportunities for working class people and middle class people. And so certainly the financial problems that Spain has been having in recent years has made it difficult. The people with money are still doing well, but the working class people are not doing nearly as well.
Okay, Yukon Huang, you know, we talk a lot about the income gap, the wealth gap in developed countries because it makes the news all the time, because people are talking about it all the time. But it is far more prevalent in developing economies than, you know, we talked about China. What about other parts of the world?
Well, if you go back and look at Latin America, portions of South Asia, Southeast Asia, you find that inequality tends to be very, very high. And there's a measurement, the Gini coefficient. The closer it is to 1, you have very inequality, and when it's low, it's basically much better. So the Gini coefficient, for example, in Latin America has approached 0.5, 0.6. It's relatively high. In China, it's 0.47. Ironically, that coefficient, 0.47, is exactly the same as the U.S. It's actually the same as Singapore, Malaysia. So by that definition, all these countries have what I call a significant degree of inequality. The interesting country is Korea, South Korea. The Gini coefficient in South Korea is only 0.35. It's one of the lowest in the world. So that's a country that's actually managed to grow very, very rapidly, but actually grow in a much more egalitarian form. And that's an issue that people have to look at more carefully. How do you manage both growth and become relatively more egalitarian in the process?
Okay, and we're going to have to leave this discussion right there. Yukon Huang, Darrell West, thanks to both of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And to continue the conversation, join us on Facebook @CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.